So we're here filling in, but with his topic. And the topic, as Mr. Nordquist was saying there, is that democracies don't fight each other. And it's sort of kind of true, but it's not really a very scientific sort of a statement. There are exceptions. Of course, the North and the South fought each other. They're not only democracies. Israel, which is sort of a democracy, has fought Lebanon, which is sort of a democracy. And I think what's really going on there is it's a kind of mistaken description of a different phenomenon. The reality is almost all democracies in the world are European powers, other than Japan and now South Korea, which was a dictatorship for decades after the war. But essentially, virtually every major democracy on the planet is part of America's world empire, our Pax Americana. So in a sense, as the neocon hawks like to say, America has kept the peace for 75 years. Now they're not counting Korea or Vietnam or any of the coups or the putting down insurrections in East Timor, or 2 million dead Iraqis and Syrians and Yemenis and Libyans and etc. But what they mean by it is we kept the peace in Europe, between the major powers in Europe. And that's kind of true, right? Because of American dominance of Europe, that means that Germany and France cannot fight each other any more than Texas and Louisiana can, because the US federal government is there as the dominant power preventing that from happening, which is, hopefully the American dominance part is just temporary. The peace ought to be able to last, but, and frankly, like, I'm probably overstating if I say America's keeping the peace there. France and Germany don't have anything to fight about now. And as long as we can encourage more and more open trade, whether through the EU or not, but just keeping trade and travel barriers open between peoples and between countries, making them more and more economically interdependent, is really the best way to keep the peace. And there's a real important example of this right now in between Germany and Russia. Now, as you guys know, the last 2 times that Germany and Russia fought, it was the worst thing that ever happened. And in World War II, there was something like 40 or 50 million people killed just in the European theater. And so now you have, during Obama and Trump, and now finally ending, you had this massive American obstruction of an attempt by the Russians to build a natural gas pipeline to Germany. And the Americans even went so far as to put sanctions on a Swiss company that was doing the construction, and they put sanctions on Germany, our allies, the Germans, to try to stop them from building this natural gas pipeline from Russia. And they're open about their excuses, and their excuses are that's money that Texas natural gas companies could be making, which is nothing, right? Compared to keeping the peace between Russia and Germany, there's no amount of natural gas in the world that is more valuable than keeping that peace, even from our point of view, because you might remember America intervened the last 2 times that these powers fought. And so even from our own selfish point of view, never even mind the Europeans, we should want to keep the peace between the Germans and the Russians at all costs. And then their second excuse is that, well, they're going, it's the Nord Stream, meaning North Stream, meaning the Russians don't have to ship the gas through Ukraine anymore, and the Ukrainians then are getting cut out of their transit fees. Crimea River, I don't give a damn about that at all. And for the Americans to try to invoke that as an excuse for preventing Russia and Germany from making this major multi-billion-dollar deal for essentially an indefinite business arrangement for natural gas energy to go one way and money to go the other is just, it's unforgivable. And it goes to show that, democracies led by the United States are not necessarily the peacekeepers. Oh, and one more thing, I'll do this quick. This has been an excuse, especially in the W. Bush years. We heard a lot of this, even among libertarians. Now, these are extinct now, there's no such thing. But 20 years ago, there was a thing called a liberventionist. Libertarians who bought into this story that democracies don't fight each other. So now that's a writ for the United States of America to start a war against any autocracy in the world in the name of overthrowing it to create a democracy. And so then that was one of their main excuses to go into Iraq, invoking this democratic peace theory. And even libertarians said, that's right, there won't be peace in the world until the United States of America is done overthrowing every autocrat on the planet and creating a new liberal democratic state in their place. They even said this was going to happen in Afghanistan. Can you believe that? And it's just an excuse. And it's led to, you know, what, 4 or 5 major wars and troops in somewhere between 14 and 30-something nations fighting to this day. So that's what I got to say about that.
That's Is this on? Maybe?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Oh, mine wasn't on, was it?
You're expressive, so you're fine.
I learned to project in theater class when I was a kid.
That's right. That's right. And I think Afghanistan is a really interesting extension of the American empire argument that you're bringing up, right? That we are there with NATO allies, and that we can kind of justify it on those grounds, right? Say Afghanistan hasn't been a real democracy. I don't know that many people would make that argument despite the fact that they have a president, right? That sort of thing. But I think from a free market perspective, you think of trade as being the defining friendly bond between nations. And I would tend to agree with that take, even as somebody who is very restraint-based, right? You tend to get the pejorative isolationist label left and right, quite literally. Isolation isn't the right number in my opinion, right? I think free trade is an inherently outward-looking thing, and when you think about why democracies don't fight each other, I think it's not necessarily that democracies are inherently peaceful. I think it's that when you have the trade as a crutch, that this is the important driving factor. And I also think, this is maybe just some armchair international relations, but I do think that it seems that we're much more likely to go to war with Russia than we would be with China, truth be told, just because we rely on China so badly economically. I'd be interested to hear your take actually on that dynamic. Sure.
Well, yeah, and it's worth pointing out that Vladimir Putin is a strong man, and he has amended the Constitution, but he hasn't overthrown it and declared himself the czar. He clearly means to pass on something like a Republican form of government to whoever survives him in power when he finally does die or leave. So it's certainly a more democratic system than they have in China, for example, and frankly, it's about as perfect of a republic as we have in the United States of America right now, I think. And if you consider the amount of corruption and violence, America's much worse. And our fight with Russia is purely picked by the United States of America. Many of you, especially older people, must know that George H.W. Bush had promised the Russians as the Soviet Union was falling apart. And they said for years, well, it's not in writing, so it doesn't count, but it is in writing. You can see it at the George Washington University National Security Archive online, in writing. H.W. Bush, his Secretary of State James Baker, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and I think it was Mitterrand was I forgot who was the President of France, and Helmut Kohl, who was the Prime Minister of West Germany at the time, or President of West Germany at the time. They all swore and promised in writing that they would not expand NATO, quote, 1 inch east of Germany if the Russians would leave East Germany and allow reunification. And then, of course, Bill Clinton broke that promise because he needed Polish votes in Illinois in 1996. And that was as simple as that. It's for his own personal interest that he broke that promise and began the process of NATO expansion, which through Bill Clinton, W. Bush, and into Obama is something, I'm sorry, I forget the number now, I don't want to say, but it includes the Balkans, it includes the Baltics, just under Donald Trump, even though he said he was against it on the Tucker Carlson show, under his government, they brought Macedonia and Montenegro in, and they perennially threaten, and the Democrats are the worst on this, they threatened to bring, well, lately they are. W. Bush was really bad on this too. But they threatened to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO as well. And all you have to do is put the shoe on the other foot for 1 second. If Ronald Reagan had broken the bank and it was the US empire that had fallen at the end of the 1980s and the Soviet Union had remained, And the Soviets then were determined to expand the Warsaw Pact, not only to include all of Western Europe, but then went to Latin America and started bringing nations in South America and Central America and trying to bring Mexico and Canada into the Warsaw Pact. What would we do about that? And if, as Barack Obama did in 2014, used real, no-fooling, Hitler-loving Nazis, not just neo-Nazis, but literally the grandsons of the Galatian SS from World War II, who perpetrated the Holocaust against Poles and Jews there. When Barack Obama hired them to overthrow the government in Kiev in order to install an America-friendly government there, what would America do if the Russians had tried to pull a stunt like that in Canada? Everybody in this room knows the answer. We'd go to war. America would nuke Moscow, is what they would do if Russia tried to use Hitler-loving Nazis to overthrow the government in Ottawa. Oh, and then declare a war on terrorism against the citizens of British Columbia who refused to accept the new coup junta. That's America's policy in Eastern Europe, and frankly, it's suicidal. And people just forget the danger of thermonuclear weapons. And I think they forget how many close calls that we have had based on misunderstandings and misapprehensions and just completely mistaken assumptions about what the other side will think and what the other side will do. If we do this, they will do that, and then they find out they're wrong. And they almost started a nuclear war. For one example, in 1983, they had an exercise called Able Archer, where they were practicing fighting the Russians. And there's two reasons that we didn't have a full-scale thermonuclear war during Able Archer. The Soviets were convinced that this exercise was a cover for an invasion. They're coming. They're going to nuke us in a first strike, and they're going to roll into Eastern Europe. And they were totally panicked. And the only reason they didn't launch nukes at us was because there was a Soviet spy inside NATO, a Brit, and he told them, he was a very trusted spy, and he told them, you gotta believe me, it's just an exercise. I swear to God, it's just an exercise. And then they still weren't sure. But then Chas Freeman, who some of you might know, a great China expert, Chas Freeman ran from wherever he was, I guess CIA or wherever he was, from the State Department to the White House, and like busted down the damn door screaming at them that they had to remove H.W. Bush, the vice president, from the exercise. And they let the Deputy Secretary of Defense or something like that sit in the chair instead. And then that reassured the Soviets that, okay, they're not coming. Because they thought the fact that the vice president was sitting in the chair during the exercise, that was one of the things that really made them panic. We'd all been dead. That would have been the end of mankind. That would have set back the humans in the southern hemisphere who survived, would have been set back 5,000 years, okay? It would have been an absolute catastrophe for humanity based on, don't worry, it's just an exercise. They must know it's just an exercise. We know that they know it's just an exercise, so why wouldn't we do our exercise? And they almost killed us all. And there's plenty of other examples as well. And I'll just finish with this on this point that, Pat Buchanan likes to point out, at least he said it one time, and I keep quoting him over and over again. America used to draw the line at the Elbe River halfway across Germany. And they said, if you Soviets roll across the Fulda Gap and try to roll into West Germany or France, we will go to nuclear war with you. Okay, that's the line. When the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Poles rose up in resistance against the Soviets, and the Soviets crushed their opposition, Ike Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan said, that's tough. You're on the other side of the Elbe River, we're not doing anything about it, sorry. In fact, it was Eisenhower's fault. He'd encouraged the Czechs and the Hungarians to rise up. But anyway, or the Hungarians, the Czechs. Anyway, we used to draw the line at the Elbe River, but now Bill Clinton and W. Bush and Barack Obama have moved the line 1,000 miles east to the literal Russian border, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic states. And again, they continually threaten to bring Ukraine into. And so now we have literally had American soldiers doing exercises and parading within a few hundred yards of the Russian border in Estonia. And this is from the Russians' point of view, they have no natural borders. Moscow is just like 300 miles from the border, from their western border. And there are no rivers, no mountains, no hills, no nothing. It's a wide open plain. for somebody to just march right on Moscow, which they have done over and over and over and over again throughout history. And so this is what they're absolutely terrified of. And then on the opposite side of that, though, is there a threat to the Baltic states that they really need us to keep the Russians out? No, there's not. Putin's not coming. You know, Donald Trump banged the table and demanded that Angela Merkel spend at least 2% of Germany's gross domestic product on the military. And she just dug in her heels and refused. Why? It's because she knows the Russians aren't coming. They're not coming. The American empire are the aggressors here. When they started that war in Ukraine, it was the Germans and the French came and told Barack Obama, we don't care what you say, we're making a deal with Putin and ending this war. And Obama said, fine, go ahead. And Angela Merkel and Holland went and met with Putin and signed the Minsk II deal to put an end to the war in eastern Ukraine. So these are the people who, if anybody's threatened by the Russians, it's them, and they just don't believe that they are.
Scott, a couple pieces to the puzzle. Interesting, you talked about the expansion of NATO. One of the arguments that some Americans made for the expansion of NATO was that in order to join NATO, you had to be at peace with all your neighbors and no conflicts, no border conflicts. So Hungary and Hungary and Romania think they had a border dispute. They had to solve it if they were going to get into NATO, and they went through all of them. Interestingly, the Russians watched this discussion, and they took a piece of Georgia, and they took a piece of Ukraine. So both Georgia and Ukraine cannot join NATO as long as there are Russian troops on that border, because both of them consider that a contested border that are, meaning goes, you took our territory, the Russian territory, did Ukraine, and perhaps because, one presumes because they knew the rules, that's why Russia took a little bit of each one, and it just successfully thwarted their effort to join.
Yeah, I think you speak to this really important point, and Doug Bandow for the Cato Institute just wrote this great piece where he argued that not everything is a vital interest and not everything is an important interest for the United States. And I think that's a really interesting demarcation, because I don't think that that's necessarily been a popular view in God knows how long, good Lord. Right, and we see that in NATO, and I think we get caught in these Cold War mentalities in terms of international institutions and even our presence abroad. The American military-based presence comes to mind as another example of this, just this concept that everything is an important interest and that there's no such thing as a presence too large on the American world stage, dominated world stage. I don't know, I have a certain amount of pessimism in that sense. I have optimism in a lot of foreign policy senses, in the internal war-making concerns, like in terms of what Congress has authorized presidents to do and how to act and how to behave abroad in combat. I think those things are things that I'm generally hopeful about in the coming years. But in terms of our footprint abroad, which it has to be said, it radicalizes people and it alienates allies, and it's just a very dangerous thing in my view, and fiscally irresponsible. I don't have any hope for that. I really don't. I think it's at this point too large, and we still do have this perception that everything is a vital and critical interest to the American cause.
One of the reasons people tend to be nervous about saying something's not a vital interest is at one point there was a list of vital interests and they left Korea, and Korea got invaded. So if you announce something's not a vital interest, you may have put that country in some sort of jeopardy. That said, it's just us in the room. What's the list of non-vital interests that we would mention here and not tell the Russians or the Chinese that people think might be vital, but you would argue is not?
Right, Doug in that piece, he brings up Georgia. He says, what interest could the United States have in Georgia? It's not particularly important on our list of allies, right? It's not as if, if somebody invaded Germany, I think more of the American public would care. Right? That would stir people more than if Russia invaded Georgia. But because psychologically we have to build up this wall against this perceived enemy, we see that in Ukraine as well, and in China with Taiwan and Japan, and that justifies just so much of our continued involvement in these places. I wouldn't call them essential interests at this point, or vital interests, but that's an unpopular opinion.
And I would hasten to remind everybody too that it was America's ally, friend, Mikhail Saakashvili, who started the Georgia War in August of 2008 and then lost it. And it was Barack Obama who started the war in Ukraine when he hired those Nazis to overthrow the government. And the first thing they did was declare a war on terrorism and invade the eastern part of their own country, the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, in order to crush the pro-Russian leaning population who rejected the new coup d'etat junta. And so the Russians took some advantage of that. They seized the Crimean Peninsula without killing anyone, by the way. They had a naval base there ever since the Soviet Union days, and they had continued to lease it and had no problems for 30 years until America overthrew the government in Kiev for the second time in 10 years. Bush had done the Orange Revolution in 2004 and overthrew the same guy, by the way, Yanukovych. And then Obama overthrew the same guy again 10 years later. And as soon as they did, they seized the Crimean Peninsula, and then when the government in Kiev, the new government in Kiev, attacked the people in the east, they resisted, and the Russians, by all accounts, did send special operations forces across the border to help them defend themselves from attack by their own government. But if you remember the years 2014, 2015, the New York Times banner headline, top of the fold, across the top, Russia invades Ukraine. Lie, wrong, never happened. They did that over and over and over again, claimed that the Russians were sending in armored divisions, infantry divisions, that they were invading and seizing Ukraine. Never happened. In fact, the people of the east in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Donetsk, in the Donbass region there they call it, they held a plebiscite where they voted to join the Russian Federation. And Putin told them, yet, I don't want you.
A quick question, speed round. There's anybody in the audience who thinks that there's a country we might get in a war over, or an area or part of a country, that you would say that's really not critical to the United States, but that perhaps Congress or the President would think it is, beyond Georgia, which was interesting. Yeah.
I mean, I've heard a lot of people, and I don't think people worry about Taiwan if the U.S. military were to suddenly be, thought to be not invaded, like also just be completely defensive. That if that would then entice China to for some reason invade Taiwan. I don't know what your reasoning is and what you think that why that is probably not true.
Could you, sorry, one more time?
So if say the U.S. military were to disappear, or just it would be, say that the world were to know that now the United States has a different perspective, that we're laying off, we're not attacking anybody unless we're directly attacked on our land. I've heard people say, including at this conference, you get an example, if that were to happen, China would just invade Taiwan, and it's a foregone conclusion. I'm like, wow, I don't think that would happen, but I want to know what your thoughts are on the reason.
I would ask why it hasn't happened yet.
Well, they would say that China's deterred by the might of the U.S. military, because they know if China invades Taiwan right at this point in time, then they know the United States is going to come in and say, China, back off, bomb China.
Another thought here.
I think as far as the Taiwan thing, and I may be completely wrong here, which is my thought lately, I mean, China is kind of de facto in control of Taiwan anyways. Do they really need the de jure title over Taiwan? I mean, they exercise control over it pretty much entirely. Isn't that accurate? I mean, the U.S. doesn't really do a whole lot. I mean, we buy a lot of our stuff from Taiwan, but China's really in control.
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, they have a sovereign government that's independent from Beijing. I'm sure their choices are greatly constrained, but the reality is that, you know what, if America is not there to threaten anyone who does anything, then others might do things. The question really is, and including the Chinese might invade Taiwan, but the question is whether it makes any sense for America to continue to maintain this policy of collective security that says that any conflict between nation states anywhere in the world must become our business and must be prevented by us. That's been our policy since World War II, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union. But how long is that supposed to last for real? The middle part of North America is to be the dominant power in all of Eurasia and all of the old world indefinitely? Our army is the world army from now on? It just can't work out. And as I was saying in the debate the other day, our national debt's $30 trillion. So I don't really need to win the argument. It's sort of like the war in Afghanistan. Just look at the calendar. You don't have to read my book. We lost the war. It's over. That's it. You know. And also, I should add too that Daniel Davis, Army Lieutenant Colonel, who's a great whistleblower from the Afghan War, by the way, wrote a piece for. Everybody read this website, 1945. It's a really interesting website. We run a lot of good foreign policy stuff there. Some hawkish stuff, but not all of it. And he wrote a piece about how, look, if we fight a war with China over Taiwan, we're going to lose. They're going to sink our aircraft carriers, and then which could escalate to a war including nuclear weapons. You imagine any president sitting in that chair when an aircraft carrier with 14,000 sailors on it goes to the bottom of the ocean, and what he's supposed to do about that, what any president would be likely to do in a situation like that. But Taiwan is very far from here, and to use the entire Pacific Fleet, to even get the entire Pacific Fleet over there in time to intervene, and then it would be extremely difficult. And then not only that, they've got supersonic sea-skimming anti-ship missiles that have a longer range than our F-18s. Game over. That's it. In other words, if China invades Taiwan today, America can't do anything about it except lose some sailors and watch China take over Taiwan anyway. And so, I'll stop there.
We have a question here, but I just add to the point on Taiwan, China. The Deputy Secretary of Defense pointed out that the United States has not, since we fought the British, has not had a war with anybody that had a GDP as much as 40% of ours. Japan, Germany, and World War II were a fraction of the US economy. China is significantly more than 40% of our GDP. So we can look at a lot of countries, Russia are pretty small, and their GDP of Pakistan or something, but not China.
Let me add one thing here too. And this came up in the debate the other day on Thursday, that if it wasn't us who ruled the world, it would be the Chinese. But as I was just saying, our national debt's $30 trillion. We have the most powerful economy in the world, and we can't afford a world empire. How in the world is China supposed to afford a world empire? And yes, they might take Taiwan, but does anybody really think that China's preparing to invade Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and march west and seize and conquer Eurasia and build the Eurasian empire? Or they're going to build some massive deep water navy and try to challenge the Americans and the Brits who rule the seven seas? It just makes no sense whatsoever to think that this isolationist power going back 3,000 years is now determined to what? Follow America's example of the 21st century of blowing our entire wad, trying to dominate other people's parts of the world and getting our ass handed to us? Not likely.
Todd here.
So, if the Pax Americana didn't exist and U.S. hegemony wasn't basically enforcing current borders, do you think there'd be more or less war violence currently?
Things could turn very bad. I mean, the reality is that, the UN Charter, you can kind of read it two ways, right? It either protects sovereignty or it mandates that America protect sovereignty, right? In which case, America gets to override sovereignty, like Hans Hoppe, the expropriating property protector, right? People collecting your taxes to protect your property with the money they steal from you. So there is a reading of the UN Charter that says that, look, the borders are where they are, and it's illegal now for countries to change their borders by force. And I think we all know that virtually all the borders on the planet, especially in Eurasia and in Africa, were all drawn by European powers to either divide and conquer peoples or to group them together in artificial unions in order to keep them internally divided and easily to conquer. So the world is nothing but lousy with borders in bad places. The question is, can humanity rise to the ability, to the occasion and figure out how they can negotiate these changes peacefully without, outright invasions and overthrow. And I think they also need to figure out how, when countries do violate that law, that there's got to be something that can be done about it other than relying on the United States world empire to come and be the policeman of the world, as they call it, to enforce that world law.
Todd here.
Scott, I've heard you make the point on the Tom Woods show about how Chinese culture, like the way they view the world outside of China, does not necessarily lend them to the sort of, empire building that maybe the European powers have tradition. And I was just wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit more, because I do think there is a lot of wisdom in that quote that politics is downstream of culture, and that I think that that point that you make could assuage a lot of fears that Westerners have that, oh well, if the United States recedes or the West recedes, that China's just going to run over the entire globe. So I just wanted you to flesh that out some more.
I'm certainly no expert on China, but from what I do know about them, essentially we're all foreign devils and dogs. And that's not an excuse to kill us all or enslave us all. It's a reason to stay home and leave the rest of the world alone. It's a very xenophobic culture. And this goes around. There's all kinds of cultures refer to themselves as the human beings, and everybody else is somebody else. Americans are very exceptional in that way too. But the Chinese, essentially, they turn that around. Instead of we can do whatever we want to these people, it's more like we don't want to have anything to do with them because there's no good can come of it. In fact, I think the anecdote that you're talking about, I learned from Chas Freeman. And you guys should really read Chas Freeman. The guy's absolutely brilliant. He used to be the chair of the National Intelligence Council. He went with Nixon to China to make friends with Mao Zedong. Okay, so he knows a hell of a lot about it. And he told me the story about, I don't know, 1,200 years ago or something like that, that China built the most massive naval fleet that had ever been constructed in human history. And they went sailing all around, I guess, the Indies and Africa and India and the Middle East. And then they came home and said, it's terrible out there. The food sucks, the people are idiots, and we don't like them, and it's bad weather, and sand gets in everything. And then that's it. They just don't want to have anything to do with it. And so then they brought their fleet home and they sank it. They sank the damn fleet and said, let's just be isolationists and mind our own damn business. So, that could change. You could have some sicko general in charge of the People's Liberation Army who is counting infantrymen and thinking about Siberia. I don't know. If I was China, I might invade Siberia. It makes sense, but then again, they'd have a lot to lose if they tried that too. So, it just doesn't make sense. Seriously, I was joking about this back 20 years ago, that I figured out George Bush's foreign policy. You see what he's doing? It's the only way to do it, really. He's discrediting foreign interventionism for everyone for all time. So no one's going to ever do this again.
Any other thoughts?
Secretly, one of us.
Yes.
On that same thought of disproving this being a problem, my biggest fear in this whole thing is the corporate press. We saw them pretty much scare everybody into locking themselves into their homes for a year and a half. And the current, most recent example I have in mind is the Kurds. Oh, we got to pull out Syria. No, the Kurds. We have to protect the Kurds. The Kurds. And then 2 weeks later, we never hear about the Kurds ever again. So what can we do about the corporate press, which is hell bent on keeping us forever in these wars?
Write for antiwar.com.
And who writes antiwar.com? Who are the key writers there?
Well, I'm very proud to say that we now have Doug Bondo and Ted Carpenter, the two very best guys at Cato, are now regular writers for us. The old libertarian civil wars are fading, and I've stayed friends with them this whole time, but there used to be bad blood there. That's all now gone. We've got the great Danny Sherson, he's a leftist, but still he was a major and was in Iraq War II and Afghanistan and the surges there, and is other than Doug, him and Doug are probably neck and neck in a contest for most prolific anti-war writers in all of world history, never mind our current era, and they both write for us right now. 5 times a week almost, both of them. It's just completely incredible. And then Dave DeCamp and Jason Ditz are doing the hard news stories all day. And then Ray McGovern is now writing for us, the former CIA analyst and chief of the Soviet division, is now writing for us regularly. And I'm sorry for everyone else on the Viewpoints list there, I'm blanking out, but it's, we run everybody. This is what I wish I'd said in my C-SPAN interview the other day. I forgot, I thought of this later. We run everybody from Pat Buchanan to Patrick Coburn, as long as they're good on the war.
Yes.
So as America slips from being the preeminent superpower status and the game of great powers begins again, what transformation geopolitically do you see coming in the 20s, 30s, and 40s?
Oh God, the 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Or we can shrink that to just 20s and 30s.
20s and 30s, yeah, that would be awful. You know, I've been reassured by some of Biden's current moves. I don't know that it necessarily signals that the U.S. is going to be less intent on being a geopolitical power, truth be told. You know, I've long thought that neoconservatives and liberal internationalists are two sides of the same coin. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that he entered the White House with and that Antony Blinken had upheld very early on about how America needs to lead by example and how America needs to be involved and kind of protect the order, all of that just reads like warmongering to me, just under a different, more peaceful guise. I don't know necessarily that we're going to try and back off of being a geopolitical power. It might kind of happen as you know, we get overtaken, or so to speak. Truth be told, I don't know that that's a bad thing to my eye. I'm a little bit of a pessimist about our presence on the world stage, but you know, geopolitically, I would hope that it would signal that we need to be building better diplomatic relations, that we're withdrawing from Afghanistan would transfer those resources to something more, I don't know, conversational and communicative. I don't know that that's the case. I also wish that we would, you know, end trade wars and just engage with people on that level. I also don't think that that's the case. So this is all kind of doom and gloom. I really don't see us learning from our mistakes, though, and I think that it's likely to be a lot more of the same, unfortunately.
It's not quite occupation, but I was talking to folks at the embassy in Hungary under Obama. They explained to the Hungarians who fund 16 different religions. A lot of European countries, you know, fund the major religions and to build their churches, synagogues, and mosques. And the U.S. government was sitting leaning on them to be sure and include Scientologists, and it just kept going up. And also the order of who was in the gay Pride March. Not whether you had a gay Pride March or anything, but the order of who went in. And at some point, you just wonder the pushback that you get when State Department people are telling you, I mean, there are other differences too, because the Orthodox Jews in Hungary, which most of them don't want the reform, and the conservative Jews to be included, they don't get any funding now, and the U.S. government was arguing they should, even though there aren't that many. I'm not sure you should fund any of these things. However, that said, I'm not, you know, the Americans are out there, at least in some countries, micromanaging that sort of thing, and it probably makes less friends than we think.
And think about that, the land of the separation of church and state, that they would think for a moment that that's their role in someone else's country at all. Which kind of synagogues the national government is subsidizing? Are these people completely crazy? Yeah. They're completely crazy. And you know, Charles Krauthammer in 1991 wrote in Foreign Affairs, this is our unipolar moment. The Soviet Union is gone and now we can do whatever we want, but for only a short period of time, a moment in time that we have to make the world our way before India and China and Brazil and these other kind of middle-ranked powers increase their wealth and therefore their political power in the world in such a way that it will be much more of a multipolar world, whether we literally have a United States of Latin America or a United States of Europe, or whether it's something more informal. America's relative power has been in decline since, you know, shortly after World War II. Every industrial nation on the planet had been burned to the ground at set hours. But then they started building back up again. And then, you know, that was 75 years ago.
So I went beyond that to point out that because small rogue groups could develop weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, the United States has to occupy every place that this could happen in the globe, or we're not safe. And we have to get, literally everything had to be stomped out. And there'd be no, you couldn't have some place that you didn't know exactly what was happening, because that might happen there, which I think is a lot of stuff, but yeah.
And listen, as far as like the future here, in this country, the hope is with the right. And it's really especially up to libertarians who, we're not right-wingers, but we're not leftists either. And, you know, when I did my debate with Miss Ali the other day, I was told by Spike Cohen after the event that I changed minds in there. There are right-wingers in there. They heard me talking and sat like this and say, I hate this twerk, what the hell do you think? And by the end of the thing, they said, man, I gotta admit that that's right. That's right. And you know, they're already coming to this conclusion on their own just because of the calendar. How many guys can you, we fought for 20 years to kill 400 guys, and now we got 40,000, and we're not done yet. Now we're going to just get started again all over again, or what are we doing here with this war? It's pretty difficult to twist somebody's arm to get them to believe in this stuff anymore. But what they need is leadership. They need is people like the example Ron Paul set, the example Dave Smith is going to set when we run him for president. And the example that all of you guys set when you attack the right from the right. And when a right-winger hears you criticize American interventionism and they don't hear you say, oh, but we need that money for public schools and whatever, you know, left-wing shibboleths that they're used to hearing, then you can make real headway. And look what Ron Paul did, right? Ron Paul, if you don't know anything about him, which we all do, right? But if you don't know anything about him, he stepped out of the George W. Bush cloning machine, right? They're both German stock, they're both Methodist, they're both married to their first wife, both totally square Republican politicians from Texas, right? In every way. And then Ron Paul got up there and said, you don't have to believe in this. That's not right. And by the millions, Americans said, oh, great. You know, TV said I had to be Michael Moore, the big fat communist hypocrite, glutton, ridiculous, you know, millionaire. Or I had to be Jane Fonda sitting on a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun to oppose American foreign policy. But this guy is telling me that I can, if I like my identity, I can keep it, but I can change my mind about this. And so by probably tens of millions, Ron Paul won the right over to peace. And so in America, look, the government doesn't care what we think about anything. There's scientific studies about this. The people who affect policy are lobbyists, not public opinion, except on this, okay? If the establishment in Washington, D.C. and you know, Lockheed headquarters, if they don't have the American right, they can't have a war, okay? And liberals are horrible on this. We all know liberals will go along with Barack Obama no matter who he wants to kill, even if he's taking Al-Qaeda's side. But they don't really like war. They don't really support it. Their default is post-Vietnam anti-war. It's the right wing that likes war. And if the right wing doesn't like war, then nobody likes war. And if the right wing doesn't believe in the BS that they're shoveling about why we have to do the next one, then they can't have it. And we saw this in 2013. It was the Democrats. Barack Obama could have done it. But the right wing was absolutely unanimous in this country. We are not going to war in Syria, especially with some fake chemical attack by Al-Qaeda in Turkey, false flag to lure us into the war. And they just, it was led by Breitbart.com, by Stephen Bannon and Breitbart, and you know, the other more like newer, more right-wing media. So we are absolutely not doing this. Talk radio was unanimous, therefore the Republican House of Representatives was unanimous.
Your point that George W. Bush discredited interventionism, I think is quite true. I mean, there was an argument that 17 people talked us into the first war, the second war in Iraq under Bush, neocons. And I don't know about that, but in retrospect, the only people who still support that are about 17 people. And it was an inch deep, it was a mile wide, but it was an inch deep. And looking back, there is no effort to rewrite history to explain, no, this was really a smart idea, this worked well, it was what we wanted to do. The other guys are hiding. I mean, we're the guys who cheerled for invading and occupying Iraq. I mean, there's one thing to invade Iraq and knock out the president, the other decide to stay there for 25 years. Those are two different projects. And that, I think, is discredited within the right. There's very little structural support or voices for those positions now. And if any of those 17 people showed up, there's not the audience.
Right. Well, Bill Kristol and the rest of them are all Democrats now, which is what they were before, and now they are again.
True. Was there a hand up here? One and then two and three.
Yeah, in terms of the reaching out to the right, I think obviously the populist movement created by Trump is a huge, I guess, whale, so to speak, in terms of getting that to our side. And so I wonder what is going to be the most effective way to reach out to them when we're thinking about the meta-narrative about Trump of, was he a true outsider, or was he controlled opposition? Because one of those two things is true, and that to me is the only way to explain this concerted effort from all parts of the cathedral to all turn on him all at the same time, speaking from the same script. they either hated him because he was an outsider and he wasn't doing the thing that a president should do things, or he was controlled opposition. And the reason why I lean more towards the latter is because what else would explain why he circled people all around him that hated his guts? But if that's the case, and if we want to go out to his followers to try to bring them more into the anti-war movement, and we're saying he was controlled opposition, you're kind of implying that he caved. You know, the one thing that they supported him for. So how do we balance that in terms of getting the narrative right to bring them in and not turn them off by, you know, tearing down the man that they adore so much?
They're taking notes, so everybody wants to make a point will make it, and then they will respond to that in the evening. Two.
What does China do with the massive male population that can't find a wife?
Is there a third hand over here?
Yeah. Kind of a little bit of a segue off of what he said, but we talked about the Russia situation. I'm really fascinated by that because I think, as you mentioned, you know, Putin's kind of an autocrat, so sometimes when I get into discussions with people that are maybe somewhat neocon leaning, let's just say, it's like, oh, we can't trust Putin. I'm like, well, I don't think it's necessary that I'm saying we can trust Putin in every way. But when we look at what happened like in Crimea, and I have a friend who's from Crimea, and I remember when that happened, when the annexation happened, and I was talking to him, he's laughing because his family's from there. He's like, yeah, we're 90% ethnic Russians, like we're all celebrating. And of course, the neocon warmongers tried to insinuate this as like Hitler going into Sudetenland and all this stuff. And so I guess my question is, is it even possible to cut through all of that and somehow find some way of normalizing relations with Russia? Because at the same time, the warmongers talk about this impending threat from China, which I agree is an economic threat in some respects. But if you look at world stage, I mean, what better buttress to China is there but Russia and the United States? I don't know that there is any other capability of counterbalancing China, because all human history is, unfortunately, for better or for worse, it's kind of a nations weighed against each other. There's always kind of that binary reality, but I don't know. There was a question in there somewhere, but.
Okay, is there a fourth point or question people want to add before we? Four.
You have a book for Israel-Palestine?
Not a book.
Like book recommendation?
Oh yeah, Sheldon Richman, Coming to Palestine. Absolutely. Great libertarian.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think in terms of Russia, we're so caught up in this Cold War mentality, right? We still think that they're Soviet capabilities and their Soviet threat. Economically, like you say, they couldn't match us in terms of traditional conflict, nor would they, I imagine. Yeah, to that point, I think it takes a mental reframing. I'm not sure, unless the old guard dies out and we don't have this conception of them as these, you know, these world dominators anymore. I don't know that it really could. There was a point over here that was interesting. I can't remember exactly what it was.
Trump, whether he was legit opposition or...
He's a vulgar isolationist, and I really wish he was just a nice isolationist. That'd be great for our cause, and I love him for certain things that he did in the foreign policy sphere. I do think he was a warmonger. I don't think he was a peaceful president by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe comparatively, but that doesn't make him peaceful. Yeah, as far as his followers go, I wish that they could be enveloped, but given that he was still a warmonger and had, I would argue, shitty justifications for certain foreign policy conduct, I don't know that they can be enveloped super quickly with the way that certain people on the right like to speak about foreign policy.
On the China point, China is surrounded by countries that are significant size and who either have or could get nuclear weapons and who all hate them, from India to Japan to Russia, which worries that China might come north, and their nuclear weapons is why China wouldn't grab that territory. Vietnam doesn't like them very much. The Koreans don't like them. They have to go through somebody substantial to get to us.
I'd like to address the Trump thing real quick here. I mean, I think Trump, I forgot, what was the word you used for him? Is he what, or controlled opposition? Was he genuine?
Was he a genuine outsider?
Outsider, right. Yes, he was an outsider. I mean, Trump is, and I learned this from Al Sharpton in 2015. I heard Al Sharpton on a radio show, and he said, what you people who don't come from New York need to understand is Donald Trump, to you, he's from New York. To us, he's from Queens. And that means that he's white trash, loser, scumbag, nobody to all the waspy wafts in Manhattan who all look down their nose at him and hate his guts and treat him like trash his whole life. And so he very much was an outsider to the Wall Street establishment. Hell, he owed all those banks money. And wasn't that good of a businessman. And so, you know, he really was an outsider in that sense. I mean, you have to be a senator, a vice president, or a governor to be the president of the United States. Those are the rules. And what happened was he and Roger Stone saw an opening that they had coordinated from the moment Obama was reelected in 2012. They announced outright, and on TV, they talked about it openly, that everybody knows in 2016 it's going to be Bill Clinton's wife versus George Bush's brother. And you're not, those are your choices, and that's it, and that's the way it is. And Roger Stone said, no, man, we can take out Jeb. He's weak. We can do it. Let's do it. And then I don't know if Donald Trump, I do know that he was against the Afghanistan war from at least 2013 on. He complained about the war in Afghanistan. And I don't really know whether, he probably was against the Iraq war, at least after it started. It seems like he was. But what was certain was that if he was going to take out Jeb Bush, he was going to have to beat him over the head with George Bush's war in Iraq. And so that was exactly what he did. And, you know, blamed him for 9/11 happening on his watch, which Jeb was just lost because the narrative from the Bush years was he kept us safe. And just nobody ever mentioned that, yeah, that was the one real bad day there, right? And then so Jeb got his talking points all mixed up and says in the debate, he kept us safe. Remember the rubble? And Trump goes, yeah, I do remember the rubble. He didn't keep us safe. It happened right down the street from where I live and whatever. And that was the truth. He didn't do his job for 8 months. And 3,000 Americans were killed on his watch. He should have been drummed right out of power that day for that. And Trump was willing to say that, and he had to say that. But here's the real key to me, is in the primaries, you know, it's New Hampshire, Iowa, and then South Carolina. And so when they did South Carolina, they did a debate. And in the debate, Trump said, George Bush lied us into war. It was a horrible war. We never should have done it. And a soldier got up and complained and made him take it back, but he only kind of took it back. But anyway, the next day, Donald Trump got 2/3 of the vote, and the other 17 candidates split the other third. And that's in South Carolina, the most militarized state in the Union. So you could say these are the most hoorah guys in the Union, but also they lost their brothers and their friends in that war. And it really mattered to them.
Trump's victory went beyond that. He got all the other guys on stage to agree with him, including Jeb at the end of the day.
Oh, okay.
About whether the war was a mistake. So it wasn't just I win. Everyone else says, yeah, I agree. And it really just stripped.
I don't know about Rubio admitting that. Probably the rest. Yeah, I'm sure some of the rest of them. But that really made the change. Yeah, that really made the change on the right, because you had people who had not been willing to admit they'd been wrong about Iraq until that moment, and all of a sudden they became people who never supported the war in Iraq, which is fine with me. I don't care if you lie to the pollster, just get the answer right, you know. And so, you know, that really affected a huge change on the right. But now, of course, in power, you ask the question, well, if he's not fake opposition, then how come he hired Mattis and McMaster? And the answer to that, frankly, I think everybody in this room knows, and everybody watching on YouTube later, is because the man's an idiot. That's why. It's because he doesn't know how to read beyond like a 4th grade reading level. People said he had a book of Hitler's speeches next to his bed. Yeah, do you think he ever cracked it open a single time? Give him a break, dude. The guy, his conception of politics is what he sees on CNN. Pelosi versus, you know, McCarthy calling each other names or whatever. He doesn't understand power. He doesn't understand Archer Daniels Midland and Wall Street and Israel and all of these important power factions, big pharma, whatever. Politics is TV news to Donald Trump. And so what does he know about James Mattis? He's a big, tough, macho Marine Corps general. And that's all he knew about James Mattis, and that's all. And he knew that Obama fired him for being an Iran hawk, and he knew that his Israeli patrons, like Sheldon Adelson, well, he's an American kind of, but anyway, were really, you know, that was their issue. And so if this guy's an Iran hawk and he's a big tough guy and he's got all these medals on his chest, he's going to make me look good. And he did. That was what he did. He hired all Marine Corps generals, except McMaster was an Army general. And then he thought, you know, they all made him look strong by standing around him. But what he didn't do was say to James Mattis, look, the job is ending wars. And your job is you're going to stand on my right flank and you're going to tell the American people that it's okay to end the wars now. He didn't do that. He just hired him because he's a tough guy. And so then what did Mattis do? Mattis came in and forced him to escalate the war in Afghanistan and murder another 20,000 something people with airstrikes for no reason whatsoever. And, you know, forced him to back down when he tried to get out of Syria in 2018, resigned over it in 2019, if I remember that one right. And they just did nothing but hem him in. And then, look, he hired John Bolton. Why did he hire John Bolton? Because John Bolton called him from Sheldon Adelson's office in Las Vegas and said, Sheldon Adelson wants you to hire me to be your national security advisor. Here's a guy with $10 billion in the bank. And that, according to the New York Times, he has billions. I mean, they did check. He literally has billions of dollars. And he's willing to completely sell out his own whatever small ideas he has about any of this stuff for a measly $50 million. When Donald Trump could have afforded to pay for the entire Republican Party, hell, the states and the national elections. He could have afforded to run every one of those campaigns and not even miss it. You know, he's 74 years old or whatever. He ain't gonna live 10 more years. He can't do, if he spent all that money, you know, like Brewster's Millions, he couldn't get rid of it all. And he sold out completely and against his own wishes, because look what he did in North Korea. He wanted to make a deal with Kim. And then he brought John Bolton with him to Hanoi and let him sit at the table